So this does not exactly represent the views of the CRTC, though they did their best, and it certainly doesn't represent the views of Aaron, but I am talking from a person who has worked in both places. So, good morning. And, you know, if I had to condense everything I wanted to tell you into 7 minutes, it's a bit of a difficulty. But really, the big issue for us at the CRTC is, what about carriers? Are carriers platforms in which others may innovate? Or are they in command of what's carried? You know, discuss. Carriers have the means and motives to vertically integrate. They can link the provision of services to certain carriers and not others, right? They can control what you see. And they can gather the economic surplus created by commanding the transactions. So, the most important thing for you to remember is we do not regulate the internet. We regulate broadcasters and carriers. We regulate broadcasters under the Broadcasting Act, and we regulate carriers under the Telecommunications Act. And it'll make life a lot simpler if you keep remembering we do not regulate the internet. Maybe some of you were under this view, but we don't. As well, when we deal with carriers, we got cable and telco. You know, and one got its start in the 1880s and 1890s, and the other got its start, I don't know, 1970s. So different topologies, different network architectures, and they have different obligations. So we date from about 1968, though we're a successor to previous agencies that dealing with railways and other kinds of things. And basically, we govern under the Broadcasting Act and the Telecommunications Act, and we got a third one shortly to be added, the Canadian Anti-Spam Law. But that doesn't quite address what the third one doesn't deal with what I'm talking about today. So, Broadcasting Act. When I say they're contradictory mandates, I just mean to say that the statutes they don't relate to one another. They don't govern the same things in the same ways for the same purposes. Broadcasting grants privileges to Canadian signals. It is intended to help Canadian producers of content generate and deliver that content to you. It is a comprehensive scheme of regulation, and it is essentially predicated in ideas of locality, over-the-air broadcasting, all of which have been modified to deal with the advent of cable. But it starts out in broadcasting, and it starts out in cultural protection. Telecommunications Act, quite a different piece of legislation. It deals with national development objectives. It has some consumer objectives. It encourages market forces. And mostly the thing you have to understand is it deals with carriers, okay? Carriers. And so the golden rule of established in the Telecom Act is that you're not allowed to engage in unjust discrimination or undue preference in tariffs. In other words, you can't prefer yourself, which is, of course, contrary to nature, right? So we are given extensive powers to lay off the market, both in forbearance and exemption, and a lot of the stuff we have done, as I say, 97% of telecom carriers' revenue is not regulated. So we've done a very significant level of allowing the market to work in terms of competition. But framework issues remain. So what have we done so far in relation to this question of regulating or not regulating the internet? The first part is we decided not to regulate the content on the internet as broadcasting within the meaning of the Act. I think we've had a reasonably successful sorting out of the problems of net neutrality and internet traffic management procedures. Thirdly, we've continued to foster leased access to facilities. That is to say that smaller ISPs can gain access to the facilities of larger ISPs and compete with them over the same platforms. And then we adopted usage-based billing and then retreated to a choice of capacity-based billing because the difficulty of finding out the right formula for pricing of services that are leased from larger carriers. So, network neutrality, traffic management. I think that one was reasonably well done. We favored economic measures. We favored making, when the larger carriers seek to do something, they should do it primarily by economic. They should be public, and it's a burden of them to justify what they've done. And I think that decision sort of came and went, and it was accepted, and it was really without much controversy. So those are the principles, but 7 minutes, too bad. Least access to wholesale facilities. This is a continuing and vexing problem for all of us at all times. It has been around, and it will always be around. We required the incumbents, cable and telco, to allow wholesale access at matching speeds. We evened out some of the access requirements on cable and telcos by increasing the obligations on the cable to allow it. And we declined to approve new services based on the access to the central office or the cable head end. Usage-based billing. This is the one that caused quite a bit of kerfuffle a few years back. We decided to allow a 15% discount, but we imposed bit caps on all the customers of the smaller ISPs instead of one large bit cap on the ISP itself. You know what happened. Steve will tell you more about that, I guess. But anyway, we stepped onto that landmine and had to reconsider. So we did. We went to a system of capacity-based billing, and we said, you've got a choice of two, flat rate or capacity-based. And then we issued a series of decisions recently concerning the implementation of these prices and setting prices. So essentially, the message to be taken out of the wholesale access question is that we have decided at the CRTC to allow leased access to underlying facilities so that there will be more competition in the market than would be provided by 3 or 4 very large carriers. And that policy involves regulating prices, and that policy involves fairly attentive forms of regulation. In other words, you're in the sort of ironic position of having to regulate a bunch of details to make sure that there actually is competition in the market, because reliance on just 2, 3 choices of carrier to determine all of what you get is not thought to be sufficiently pro-competitive. So, what's the issue here? What is it? What is the problem? What are we trying to do? And my view would be that we have difficulty dealing with what networks are, all of us. Every time we think about what networks do, are they like the propane distribution business, or automobiles, or dairy, or some other kind of production of thing? Or are they different? And depending on your answer to that problem, you're going to come to different ideas about how networks should be regulated. If they're special, and I think the Telecommunications Act implicitly says they are special, then they're special because they enable social and economic transactions of everybody to do everything. For lawyers to engage with clients, for automobile sales to go ahead, for all kinds. They enable every form of personal, social, economic transaction. If they're not terribly special, then they can be treated like other businesses. In that case, competition between a very few large networks is sufficient to protect the consumer and the public interest. And I don't think that debate ever goes away. There are economists who will sincerely and profoundly and eloquently defend the latter position. So, is the carrier a platform? We have promoted a vigorous policy of wholesale access. And we've said that third-party access to underlying facilities is a legitimate, if temporary, feature. United States policy has unambiguously rejected such a least competition strategy since about the 90s. And other countries have gone much further to separate out the carrier as platform from the carrier as supplier of services. Carriers have a legitimate argument that turning them into a platform, they said, well, there's no money in being a platform. There's no money in being just a bit provider. We need to get access and have and deliver content, which they do. So I'm not saying that there's any final settlement of the relationship of carrier to applications and services. I'm just saying this is the environment in which we are constantly pressed to find the right balance between roles of the carrier as a platform for innovation and the role of the carrier as a person able to earn enough money to build out his networks. So, in conclusion, 3 models of legislation coexist in this sector: broadcasting, telecom, and the internet. The model that we're all concerned with, I think, most is the internet, and it increasingly dominates how things are done. And the internet says we're not merely passive recipients, but are actors, producers, engagers, collaborators, and co-equal participants. We're not passive recipients. And I think, speaking, I think, for myself, but I think it's shared by most of my colleagues at the CRTC, our job is to ensure that we do no harm. And our job is to ensure that, as much as possible, the gains that have been made for human beings by the existence of the internet are not lost. And that is a continuing balance of several desirable things that need to be balanced out between the rights of carriers, the rights of producers, the rights of people to collaborate, produce, engage, debate. So I call it the republic of letters, is the internet. It's the old-fashioned thing that, you know, philosophers used to correspond, and they created in the Renaissance and subsequently new ideas of communication among equals. And I think that is an extremely important idea that we go forward with, is that the benefits of the internet need not be lost and should not be lost by anything we do at the CRTC. Thank you.
Okay, so I was asked to do a basic overview of what I see coming up for key digital policy issues in the next little while. I'm going to focus on 3 major issues. I'll mostly focus on internet affordability, and then I'll touch a little bit on copyright as it relates to the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, as well as online privacy. And so what I hear from Canadians on a daily basis is that they feel like they're stuck, and that they're stuck in what I think is a broken telecom market. We have 94% of the market in both wireless and wired internet that are controlled by a few companies. And thus we end up paying some of the highest prices for some of the worst service in the world. And I mean, the reason for that is some of what Tim was talking about in terms of the wholesale and retail environment. And basically, we have a dysfunctional market on our hands. We have incumbent providers who are both playing in the retail market, delivering access to internet users, and at the same time, they're also supposed to be delivering access to infrastructure for their competitors. And obviously, there's a disincentive for them to do so, and then the inefficiency and transaction costs that creates are passed on to Canadians, and then we thus have limited choice. So in terms of policy, the good news is that there's some things coming up that might help deal with this problem, and one is the cell phone, the CRTC's cell phone code of conduct. They recently had a hearing in weeks past, and the code of conduct should be finalized in the coming months. Basically, it's a national set of rules for cell phone companies that will that should make it so that we can get out of restrictive 3-year contracts. It should stop automatic renewals. It should make it easier to unlock our phones, and thereby making it easier for us to find independent, affordable options. Another major issue underneath the affordability. Oh, look at that. That's fun. So that's the image I was using. I was going to use when I was talking about how people feel stuck. There's the broken telecom market. There's some missing images here, but okay. This is easier. Okay, so the next thing I'll talk about is Rogers Communications takeover of new entrant spectrum. So basically, during the AWS spectrum auction a few years ago, there was spectrum assets that were set aside to provide Canadians with new cell phone options. And Rogers has found a way to work with Shaw to get access to that spectrum that was set aside. Now the good news is the industry minister can uphold the rules and make sure that that spectrum, that key infrastructure is maintained by new entrants rather than Rogers. But so far he has yet to do so. And I think, if we look at some of the recent controversies that have happened, I think the political costs will continue to mount until the industry minister does the right thing and comes out and stops Rogers from taking over that key spectrum. The last thing I'll talk about affordability is authentic wired internet competition, and that goes to what Tim was saying, in that what we need to do is we need to break up the big telecom bureaucracies in this country. We need to do what's called structural separation. They've done it elsewhere in the UK and Japan with great success. And basically we need to move towards a model where we have a plethora of independent ISPs who are able to compete on a level platform. And there's several things the CRTC can start doing to enable that to happen. And one is getting the pricing right for wholesale, which they're starting to do, and hopefully will move forward progressively. And another thing that is really essential is making sure that independent ISPs have access to the next generation fiber networks. Because if they don't have access to that, then going forward, they're obviously going to be out of the game. So it's essential that we do those two things to move us forward. So the next thing I'll talk about is copyright. So as many of you will probably know, we passed C11, our copyright legislation at the end of last year. There's some problems with the digital lock provisions, but overall it's a fairly balanced piece of legislation. But not long after, the government joined the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement negotiations. And basically this is an international agreement negotiated in secret with 10 countries, including Canada, the US, Australia, New Zealand, Chile, and others. And basically within that agreement, we've learned from leaked documents, because again, all the documents are secret. We've learned from leaked documents that there are provisions in there that would criminalize common internet activities, enable media conglomerates to block websites and remove content, as well as erode privacy and do things like collect our online information without a court order or a warrant. And so we'll see what happens, but they're trying to finish this agreement by the end of the year. Now they could pull these provisions out. One thing that I've asked the chief negotiator of Canada is for them to make a firm commitment to stand by our legislation. And I think that's a call we should all make to our government. We just passed that legislation after 10 years of debate. It's not too much to ask for them to stand by it now. But we'll see, and they're planning to wrap that up by October, but we'll see how it plays out. So in terms of privacy, so the government's online spying bill C30 has recently been retracted and shelved, thankfully, and that legislation would have enabled a range of authorities to have access to the law-abiding Canadians' private information at any time without a warrant. Thankfully, they pulled back on that. And so now moving forward, now that I think Canadians have kind of woken up to how precarious our privacy is, for example, the fact that actually right now, ISPs and online service providers can and do regularly pass on our private information to authorities without a warrant. They're allowed to do that now. They're just not mandated to, and they usually do. So now it's time for us to put in new safeguards. And those new safeguards can come through Bill C12 or Bill C55, which are both moving through Parliament right now, or they can come through other mechanisms. And so one of those new safeguards should be mandatory that you get a warrant before you access the private information of law-abiding Canadians. That seems like a pretty common sense response. And the other is making sure there's proper reporting and oversight. So that if they are collecting our information, that there's some sort of reporting mechanism so we can keep track of this stuff. And so I'll leave it there, and I look forward to the conversation.
I appreciate the opportunity to share some of the lessons I learned at Wicket, because I was in Dubai for 4 wonderful weeks. So I thought maybe I'd set this up a little bit in terms of the global perspective on what the debate was at Wicket. And it's kind of an interesting term Wicked tends to sound a little bit like it was very wicked, but it was an interesting debate. Let's leave it at that. I mean, it was originally, the last time this was opened up was 1988. It was all focused on telecommunications. At that point in time, it was government-owned telecommunications facilities, and there needed to be agreements between countries as to how networks operated and how they were going to exchange traffic across borders. So that was the impetus in 1988. Well, we have competition now. It's changed the world, not only changed it in terms of lots of private independent companies offering telecommunication services, but networks have progressed from the traditional circuit switched topology into a more IP network open topology. So, you know, in 2012, after a lot of debate, treaty was opened up to address these changes. What did they need to do? How would we define it? Where is it going to go? I mean, those are a lot of the context around the treaty discussion itself. Now, when you looked at the whole treaty process at the very end of the debate, this is what it looked like. The 55 countries in white are the countries that decided that they would not sign the treaty or indicated that they would not support the treaty at the conclusion of the conference in December. Doesn't mean that this won't change over time as countries go back, they consult domestically, and determine where they're going to stand with the conditions and terms within this new treaty language. And to give you some context, originally the ITRs, the treaty in 1988, was 9 pages. Now, there were a lot of caveats associated to it, so when you looked at the whole package, it was about 50-some pages, with countries saying that everything applies but this article for me and my country, and that was some of the caveats. Well, today, 2012, the treaty itself is now about 30 pages itself, with caveats yet to be determined as these countries move forward to adopt the legislation or ratify the treaty. So what were the key issues in this debate? Well, when you looked at it, it was more the issues for developing countries and what their problems were with telecommunications networks. And in turn, what their problems and what they were trying to do internally with moving from a government-owned telecommunications infrastructure transitioning still to some sort of competitive landscape with 2 or more providers. They needed to know about security. They still don't understand IP addressing and the role of government in IP addressing. Numbering, is it telephone numbers? Is it IP addresses? Is it domain names? What all falls into the numbering schematic that they're supposed to play a role in? What's peering and interconnection? I mean, I had some dialogue with some countries who didn't understand what went into a peering agreement, so therefore they felt that they must mandate certain conditions and requirements for this commercial arrangement between ISPs or networks. They didn't know. And there again, do you need to update tariffs? What kind of infrastructure is required? Another very key thing is spam. What is spam? It's clogging my network, it's slowing down my connections, it's causing a lot of expense on my end. How do we get rid of spam? And then censorship and human rights was a big article that they talked about, because free and open access to the internet and the content on the internet and the exchange of that content is very critical. So what were the takeaways? Well, when you look at it from my perspective, the discussion in Dubai is just the tip of the iceberg as the whole debate moves from the traditional networks into the internet. And what is the internet? Is it content? Is it the resources on it? Is it security? Is it the technical process? There again, the ITU has a whole sector devoted to standards development. It works sometimes with the Internet Engineering Task Force, which has been focusing for 20+ years on development of internet-related protocols, standards, and related network architecture. Sometimes the ITU decides that they are the preeminent organization and should define that role for the internet, and other times they do not. So there's a big tug and pull going on there in terms of the relevance of the whole technical debate. The economics. Most developing countries, in particular, rely on the International Settlement Exchange, that's traffic termination within the country. It is built upon the traditional circuit switch network, which is very hierarchical and very defined, so you know where traffic is handed from this point to this point to this point, so you can follow it to get your payment as it crosses your border. The internet doesn't operate that way. So countries are looking at this for the economics, and so how do I account for the traffic? How do I get my money for the termination? That's yet to be defined. There again, the role of the ITU, what does that all mean? And then when you get down to it, the divide that was created as a result of the treaty, with the 55 countries that indicated that they would not support the text of the treaty. Have we created a bifurcated internet? Have we created islands of internet or islands of networks as a result of some countries buying into the new terms and conditions and others saying that they will not support it or adopt it? What does that leave us in terms of the global playing field? Things that are still under debate. Now, in terms of specifics, I thought I'd give you some examples in the treaty text itself as it relates to how things are progressing more into the internet space. In particular, content was captured, whether we liked it or not. Article 1 stated that the treaty was not about content. However, when you moved into Article 5B of the treaty, it's about unsolicited bulk electronic communications. There's a huge debate about spam. So if it's not about content, but it's about doing something with spam emails on a network, what is this all about? How does this work? It just means that there's more and more creep into managing, trying to control whatever the content is over a network. As you know, with the internet, the network doesn't know the content that travels over it. It's not its responsibility. It's the sender and the receiver who has some role in determining the content that goes between them. So making the network have that obligation is going to be rather restrictive. Yet to be defined, could still be restrictive, could be wide open. As we move into what this all means and how this applies, there are going to be changes. Misuse. Misuse was a big debate. And misuse of what? Some countries were concerned about misuse of telephone numbers. Other countries have a perspective that IP addresses are being misused because some regions have more than other regions and they can't get to, in particular, like IPv4 addressing. So it's not a fair allocation, and therefore things have been misused. And someone needs to step in and make this all fair and reasonable for me, whatever that might mean. Now, in terms of the treaty text, they just want member states to agree amongst themselves that they will work to confine misuse, however that progresses through the whole adoption of the process. Now, the most troubling aspect in terms of the internet is Resolution 3. It's not actually part of the treaty, but it is part of the treaty by association. And this resolution is all about the internet. It's all about what the ITU's role is in internet governance, internet architecture, in the overall management of IP space. Very problematic. There again, it isn't yet to be defined. Now, if we look ahead in terms of all these things that are yet to be defined, here is the timeline of where events will actually start to consolidate and frame those yet to be defined things. Now, these are various ITU events leading up to Plenipot 2014, where the whole ITU Constitution and Convention will be readdressed and reopened. That process is all about the debate on the ITU's role in its three sectors. The radio sector, which is pretty clearly defined. The development sector, which does have a role. Most of it is clearly defined, although there's some areas that could stand for further development. And the T sector, the telecommunications standardization sector, which is trying to move more and more into we are the sole source for everything internet. Now, the events leading up to that, WTPF, the World Telecommunications Policy Forum, is this May. That policy forum topic, as determined by the ITU, is the internet and internet governance. It's tied to the 3 resolutions that currently exist at the ITU, framing the internet, and from there it will move into using Resolution 3 to further clarify what policymakers think the role of the ITU ought to be. The output of that will feed into the Plenipot discussion. From there is the Developing Sector, or WTDC, World Conference that defines for the developing world what's the capacity building process that is out there. How are we going to further exchange information, knowledge, and other expertise to assist the developing world to grasp this and implement it and raise themselves into the modern world. All of that leads then into Plenipot 2014. It's in October of next year. That is when the role of the ITU will cross in terms of their role with the internet, defining what is an ITC, because right now that is a term of art. It can mean many different things to many people, and it depends on where you put the "and" between, is it, you know, communications and telecommunications, or how do you want to define that? That is coming up for the ITU to define for its role, and we suspect at the Internet Society that they're going to use that to leverage it more and more into the internet policy space. It's a concern. So post-Wicket, what are our opportunities? Well, there's a lot of opportunity we saw to learn from the debate that occurred, to learn from the issues that in particular developing countries have that we can leverage. We need to outreach both to our internet community as well as to these countries who need to understand more about what is an IP network. What is the internet? Because there's a lot of confusion. When you look at traditional telecom ministers, and apologies to the CRTC, you know, they understand traditional networks. So they look at the internet more like a traditional network. It is not. But you can't sit here and say, well, the internet, let's see, the traditional network that you're used to is layers 1 through 3, and layers 4 and above are the internet. Well, not really. It would be nice if it could be that clear. It's a mix of things. You can't clearly say the network is here and there's a bright line and the internet is over here and it should be free and open and we don't want a lot of regulation around it. It's more of exchanging knowledge, information, and ensuring they understand the architecture of the internet and the network of networks to move this forward rather than to establish bright lines to say, here is our side and there is your side, because it will not work. So what do we need to do? Well, we are working globally, we are working regionally, and we're also working individually with countries to try to bring resources to them, to build upon their expertise so that they have the knowledge base to determine what is the role of the government in all of this process, because that's what they're eager to try and understand, and in that void, they're moving from their area of expertise, which is traditional telecom. Industry needs to understand what their role is, much like the experience with one country in Africa. The regulator didn't understand peering agreements, while the ISP industry had been using peering agreements for quite a long time in that country. And so the regulator felt that they must mandate certain conditions in a peering agreement that the industry had already moved forward with something else. Somehow we've got to arrange that there's an exchange of knowledge and assurances, because governments want to play a role, but they need to understand what is going on so that the roles that they decide to take and the path they decide to take doesn't lead to the unintended consequences that will bifurcate the internet, create regional internets, local internets that will break what the wonderful innovation is that we have today. Thank you very much.
In light of policy and regulatory debates in Canada, and in light of international events like Wicket, what will the internet look like in 5 years? Who wants to take that one?
Well,
okay, go, Karen.
I can start with my rosy view as to how I would like it to look. I would like it to stay open. I would like it to stay as innovative as it possibly can, because with its openness and its borderless view of everything, it allows people to contribute and collaborate from all points of the globe. And we want to ensure that that collaboration can continue. I think we want to make sure that the internet can progress such that access to information can be retained, that it isn't restricted, that there isn't this border gateway that stops that free flow of information. Because it's important in not only for human rights, it's important for education. There are countries that don't have an educational infrastructure where they can reach out to universities in Canada and other developed countries to get the knowledge and learning they need to move forward within their own domestic arena. That's what I would hope that the internet looks like in 5 years.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to open the floor to questions from you. There are microphone runners on the floor, and if you'd like to ask a question, all you need to do is raise your hand, and one of the runners will bring you a microphone. If you could please keep your questions short. We only have time for maybe 2, possibly 3 questions at the moment, but there will be other question opportunities throughout the day. So as our intent is to hear from as many people as possible throughout the day, I'm going to ask that you please identify yourself as you pose your question. And with that, I'll open the floor. Over here, please. Turn the mic on. There we go.
There we go.
Hi.
My name is Jean-François Mézé. I have a question for Madame Mulberry. We know about the World Wide Web. We know about the great success that the internet has had basically as a rogue Wild West without government interference, being able to create something that bypasses all the governments and create something worldwide. What is wrong with the current way the internet is governed that needs the ITU to come in and change this? We've heard a lot about the recent thing. I'd like to have your opinion as to why there needs to be change in the current structure.
Okay.
Why I think some countries want to change the structure, because personally I don't think there's a need to change the governance process we have today. It's collaborative, it's a multi-stakeholder process. The biggest issue I see with the process as it's evolving today is there are a lot of governments who are used to more of a traditional role in the process, and they don't understand what it means to be part of a multi-stakeholder community. They're used to more of a top-down authoritarian approach instead of, like for example, the IGF, where we can all sit in a room and have a very open and frank dialogue. A lot of governments find that a little frightening. And it's a matter of progressing what it means to be part of the multi-stakeholder community. And there again, in my opinion, it's also allowing them to see how dynamic and how valuable that exchange is. Now, we at the Internet Society have taken upon ourselves for the last year or so to have a kind of a fellowship program where we invite policymakers from developing countries to attend an IETF meeting so they can understand how the dynamics of the internet architecture and the collaboration that occurs happens, so that they can be part of the process. Now we have them to attend meetings. We've got one coming up in Orlando in a couple of weeks. We have participants, in this case a lot of them from Latin American countries, coming to see the dynamics, to be part of the multi-stakeholder process. And if you've ever been to an IETF meeting, you know, everyone has a voice. You come in with an idea, and you may be shot down, and then you've got people who will go out on the side and say, but if you look at it this way, and this way, and this way, and this way, let's bring it back in, and let's fix it. Let's all work together and solve the problem. I mean, we've done that with some African countries last year who didn't understand BGP. They thought BGP could be the internet accounting system, much like, you know, they have something set up for circuit switch telephony and international termination rates. And so we had Fred Baker from Cisco, who is the originator of the BGP protocol many years ago, sit down with them and explain to them how the protocol works and how, even though the ITU told them that BGP could be their accounting protocol for the internet traffic, it was not designed to do that. And there was no way to design the BGP protocol to do what they wanted unless you wanted to break everything. And if you broke everything, there would be, you know, global cost to change it to suit what they were trying to accomplish.
Thank you. Tim, go ahead.
Jean-Francois, I think essentially the question is that what happened in the ITU recent discussions was Titanic hit an iceberg. And I don't know which is which in this metaphor, but the liberal market democracies are used to government by discussion. And they're used to the idea that there's a multiplicity of interests. I think if you look at the preponderance of those who didn't have that view, you'll see authoritarian states who are used to democracy as you do as I say, and others who were in the third world more looking for the return of the kind of inter-country transfers that were characteristic of the old telephone system. And that debate, again, is just not going to go away. I was extremely proud of Canada and those countries that just did not knuckle under to the ITU. I think the ITU it's wrecked itself, frankly, but it'll take a long time for that to be perceived. But the internet will continue to it may fragment at political or technical levels. I don't know. You can look at China, which is behind its own gigantic firewall. I mean, is that part of the internet as we understand it? Discuss. But really what goes on is a characteristic debate between governments that are accustomed to a plurality of voices in parliamentary discussion vis-a-vis those kinds of governments where it's you do as I say. And I think that will not stop anytime soon.
Steve?
The other reason why some are calling for the ITU to take on a larger role, I agree with everything that was just said, is that some of the current governance bodies are pretty US-centric, like ICANN. It's a legitimate critique. And that's part of why some groups are calling for the ITU and a more internationally focused body to take on a more active role. I still agree with what's being said, but that's also part of the reason.
Okay, thanks. As you may be aware, we're also live webcasting the conference today. So I'd like to draw the panelists' attention to the monitors. We have a question from Susan Feldman in Toronto. The question is, do you think it is reasonable to exchange efficiencies for security?
We all do every day. I mean, if you think economically about anything, you think in terms of trade-offs between desiderata, and we all like efficiency and we all like to be secure. So the question, in a sense, is there's no absolute truth in any of this.
Okay. Any other comment?
I agree. It's a balance in the process. Do understand the spam equation in terms of how it relates to security and how, initially just spam has morphed into all kinds of other phishing events, identity theft and everything else. So do we need to balance that against the free and open access to content and things on the internet? Yes. Sure. I mean, part of it, I think, is building the knowledge of, if you're going to do these things, be aware what you click on, rather than having the network be so controlling that it prevents you from choosing what you'd like to do. So there is a balance in the process. And I think arming people with knowledge of and choices is the most important thing.
Okay, thank you. And are there any other questions from the floor? Over here on the right. It's coming.
Hi there.
There you go.
My name's Evan Leibovich. I'm one of the people involved in creating a Canadian chapter for ISOC. And my question is for Ted, and it has to do with something on one of your slides that said that carriers were concerned that if you divorce carriers from content, that it just makes them public utilities, and that was a complaint. And maybe this dates me, but I remember when there was Videotron and Rogers and Bell and BC Tel before the internet, and they were carriers and they didn't get involved in content, and they weren't exactly money losing. I'm curious to know the problem that we're finding right now in carriers saying that they have to own content in order to be profitable. Why is this such an issue now when it wasn't an issue pre-internet?
Okay.
I think I can only answer the question now. And the question now is that bits are increasingly commoditized. Content is where the value add is, and if you can use your exclusive access to content to drive people to your platforms, then you make more money. That's presumably what they feel. And so they're in a conflict of interest between, as network managers, they would like to fill their platforms with bits. But as owners of content, they would prefer to make more money out of those bits, which is content, for which you're ready to pay $7, $3, or whatever dollars a pop, vis-a-vis $7, $3, or $10 per month for a set of a bit stream. So the interests of carriers as owners of content conflicts with their interest as managers of networks.
Steve?
Yeah, I definitely don't think that they need that. They don't need to control content to be profitable, to invest in their network, and I think those arguments are pretty suspect. And I mean, we have one of the most concentrated media markets in the industrialized world, and these companies are very profitable, and I think what we're looking at is kind of a bunch of companies that have been coddled by regulations, and they have a failure to launch. Like, they should go into other markets if they want to grow, rather than trying to more tightly control the markets in Canada. And I think those arguments don't hold a lot of water.
And Karen?
If I could add some 2 cents, putting on an old hat. I used to be a traditional telco network planner. And I think the process there, again, is tied to old thinking and mentality about controlling the network. And as Tim pointed out, the network is now bits and bytes, and it's no longer something you can control, but because it's a network of networks. So now the traditional mentality is moving into, well, we will control the content. Now there's a lot of us who would like to see that there isn't a need to restrict content, that it's user defined, and user opts into the content that they would like to see. The network shouldn't restrict, own, manage, or control anything around that process, which we find rather abhorrent in trying to restrict my free right to see something on the internet. How you're going to change that mentality, I don't know. I mean, it's something that I think is kind of inherent in the whole telecommunications structure in itself, that we need to own and control bits and bytes, and if we can't control the network, we'll control the content, and who knows what it's going to be in another 10 years as the whole infrastructure innovates into something else.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take another question from our web participants. This one from Monsieur P. Bouchard, Montreal.
From Montreal. Is China participating in the ITU? So what will Canada or the government of Canada do to control spam?
Will the government of Canada or the CRTC plan on doing to reduce spam coming from China?
There are entire sections of the speech that I didn't read that deal with what we're dealing with spam, but the Canadian anti-spam legislation is being passed, the regulations are being drafted, and there will be international cooperation to reduce spam. But that is a serious problem because, of course, it requires international cooperation, and it's beyond domestic jurisdiction. So I don't have a complete answer for him. All I know is that we're working on it in a very serious way.
Karen?
I can tell you that there are industry organizations out there. MOG is one of them. It's the Malware Mobile Messaging Working Group. It's a global organization that is focused on managing spam as a private government partnership. They work very closely within the government regulation, in particular like the CAN-SPAM app that is being implemented here in Canada. And then with the ISPs and network operators and the bulk email distributors as to how they can do everything legitimately following best practices rather than having even more restrictive legislation. Because the industry feels that they can move faster than governments can in addressing an issue that comes up and shutting it down very quickly, rather than waiting for some mandate from a government that might take a year or more to happen, and then you've got botnets everywhere, and it's a situation that you can't contain.
Okay, good. We have one more question from the room, if there is one. Over here.
Yes, thank you. My name's John Anderson. I want to go back to the first topic that was raised, and I think if I can frame it in my terms, the question is, as an internet user, how do I access my choice of ISP? And then there's the other side that says, I'm a small ISP, how do I access the infrastructure so that I can reach my customers? It seems to me that we can talk about a network of networks, we can talk about access, but what it comes down to, I think, is infrastructure. And one of the things, for example, we have right now is, I live in a neighborhood, we've got Bell telephone everywhere, we've got Rogers everywhere, they own the infrastructure. Now, the question is, how do other little ISPs get access to that infrastructure? And on the other side, how do I, as a user, access my ISP of choice? It seems to me, and I'd like somebody to comment on this, why do we not have the infrastructure and the operators of the infrastructure, and I'm using a term that I can't define precisely, why don't we classify them as common carriers where they have to provide access to everybody that wants it equitably? How does that work?
Any takers?
Well, I got to avoid committing suicide here.
I'll protect you.
Thank you. Yeah, it might be nice, but you have very serious owners of capital with very serious business plans who would say, "To hell with that." I don't think there's any. There's no technical impediment to that. The fact is, they own that property. They have those rights. They have been granted those rights and privileges for a long time, in some cases for nearly 100 years of regulation. They are carefully, we hope, regulated. And yes, the question is, what is the role of the carrier? And they say, I'm sorry, the role of the carrier is to deliver end services to people so that they can enjoy them, and we'll charge them the money for that under controlled circumstances of some form of regulation. And that is a completely different model than, we supply the highways and someone else will supply the cars, particularly if all the money is in the cars, not in building the highways. So you've asked the question, but there is no immediate and obvious answer to how we're going to get from here to there, nor do I see the political will to do so.
I think that we can look to other jurisdictions, especially the UK, who have taken that approach, where they have separated them out, and they did exactly that, and it worked really well. And they've done it elsewhere as well, and so we know the answer, actually. Markets that are like Canada, where you have a few incumbents who control both sides, generally don't have as affordable rates, don't have as much choice as those who separate them. And so I think there is a question of how to get there, and certainly now that we're going to fiber, one way we might move forward is saying that fiber has to be, we're going to separate that going forward. And so, I think the precise way that we do that is something to debate, but the fact that we need to go in that direction, to me, it's the case is closed. It's that's the way to go, is to separate them. From what I hear from Canadians, which I think are the people who should be driving policy, not industry lobbyists, from what I hear from Canadians is they want access to independent, affordable options. And the way to get there is to adopt the UK's model of separating.